The hall had 36 tables. Willa had counted them in her first week, during the long hours when counting was the only thing that kept her hands steady. 36 tables, 4 benches each, 248 seats when the hall was full. She knew which floorboards groaned, which torch brackets had loose screws, which side door the senior servants used when they wanted to avoid the steward's eye. 3 years of this room, and she could walk it blind. She moved along the far wall with a platter of bread, eyes downcast, steps measured. The Alpha King sat at the head table with his council. She did not look at him directly. She had not looked at him directly in 3 years, but she did not need to. She knew the shape of his presence, the particular weight of silence that gathered around him when the conversation at the table was one he had not chosen to join. Tonight, the silence was heavier than usual. "The northern delegation arrives Friday," one of the council members said. "The border dispute requires a formal response before then." Willa set the bread at the far end of the table and retreated 2 steps. "Draft 1, the Alpha King said. "I'll review it in the morning." That was all. The council member nodded and the conversation moved on. Willa turned back toward the kitchen corridor. She had been planning to leave for 11 days. She had a route mapped: Eastgate, Merchant Road, 3 days on foot to the valley town where she had left Colin with a family that asked few questions and needed an extra pair of hands. She had a small pouch of coins saved, enough for a week of travel and a night's lodging at each stop. She had been planning to leave. But 2 months ago, the letters had stopped. Colin had written every 6 weeks without fail for 3 years. Brief letters, always through the same merchant carrier. News of the farm, occasional complaints about the weather, once a short and careful description of a horse he had helped foal. She had read each one so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. Then nothing. 6 weeks. Then another 6. Then 2 more weeks of silence that felt different from all the silence before it. She told herself there were explanations. The merchant carrier had changed routes. Colin had grown older and decided letters were unnecessary. The farm had been busy. She had told herself all of these things. She did not believe any of them. The platter was empty. She carried it back through the side corridor to the kitchen, passing the entrance to the east wing without pausing or glancing toward it. The corridor branched 30 feet ahead. Left led back to the kitchen. Right led to the east wing. And at the end of the east wing, the archive. She had known about the archive for 2 years. She had discovered it the same way she had discovered most things in this palace, by being assigned to clean a corridor and paying close attention. The door had a keyhole on the outside. No handle. No way in without the specific key, which she had never seen and had no idea where it was kept. She turned left. 3 years ago, she had been 20 years old and standing in the dark. The storage cellar beneath her family's house had a smell she could still call up without trying. Cold earth, old grain sacks, the mineral bite of the stone walls. She had pressed herself into the far corner with Colin's face shoved against her shoulder, her hand over his mouth, and she had listened. She had been counting that night, too. Not tables, wolves. By sound, by the vibration that traveled through the ground when a large mass moved in coordination, by the pauses between one sound and the next. She lost count at some point. She did not remember losing it. What she remembered was the specific quality of the silence after. Not the sounds. The sounds she had buried as deep as she could manage, and they still found their way up sometimes in the hour before dawn. But the silence after was something different. It had weight. It had a particular kind of finality that she had not known existed until she heard it, and she understood it immediately and completely without anyone explaining it to her. Colin had been 14. He had understood too, she thought. He had not made a sound. She had kept him in the cellar until full dark, and then gotten him out through the back field and walked without stopping until they reached the road. She had made decisions that night with a clarity that came from having no other options. One merchant family she knew by name from market days. One town 3 days' walk east. One story. She was his older sister. Their parents had died of fever. They had nothing left and nowhere to go. She left Colin there at dawn on the 3rd day. He had not let go of her sleeve. She had unpeeled his fingers one by one, which was the most deliberate thing she had ever done, and she had told him she would come back for him. She had believed it at the time. She still believed it. But 3 years had passed, and she had not come back, and now his letters had stopped. She reached the kitchen and handed the empty platter to a younger serving girl without a word. The first 4 months passed without incident. That was the thing about passing unnoticed. It required constant maintenance. A wrong word, a glance held a second too long, a reaction that didn't fit the careful ordinariness of Bess. She had built her cover the way her father had taught her to build a blind in the field, slowly, from available materials, with patience as the primary tool. She scrubbed floors. She carried platters. She learned the rhythms of the kitchen hierarchy with the specific attention of someone who understood that in any closed system, the dangerous people were not always the ones with the most authority. Month 4 brought the first real test. The evening meal was a formal affair. 6 council members, 2 visiting lords from the Eastern Territories, and the Alpha King at the head of the table. Willa was assigned to the bread station, which meant moving along the side wall at intervals, refilling baskets, staying out of the line of conversation. The visiting lord with the silver beard had been drinking steadily since the first course. By the third, his voice had the particular carry of a man no longer calculating volume. "Clean business, that Voss matter," he said. "Efficient. Some of us in the East have been saying for years that certain clans were allowed to operate with too much. The Eastern Trade Agreement." The Alpha King's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "We were discussing the terms of the Eastern Trade Agreement." The silver-bearded lord blinked. "Of course. Yes." The conversation corrected itself. Willa was at the far end of the table, reaching for an empty bread basket. She did not pause. She did not react. She was already withdrawing, basket in hand, turning toward the kitchen corridor. She did not see him look at her, but she felt it, the specific quality of attention that her senses could not suppress regardless of how carefully she maintained everything else. A second, maybe less. Before she lifted the cup, before she turned, his eyes had moved to where she stood in the shadows. She kept her back straight and her pace even and walked through the side door. In the corridor, she stopped and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, breathed, kept moving. Month 8 brought the East Wing assignment. A senior servant was down with a pulled shoulder, and the usual cleaning rotation was reshuffled. Willa received the East Corridor without asking for it. She spent the morning working it systematically. Stone floors, torch brackets, the narrow window ledges. She did not move quickly. Thorough gave her time. The archive door was at the far end. She had heard it mentioned once, obliquely, by 2 kitchen workers near the herb garden. "The room he keeps locked." That was all, no other detail. She had filed it and waited. Up close, the door was unremarkable. Old wood, iron banding, hinges that had been oiled recently, not the hinges of a forgotten room. Someone used this space regularly. She ran her eyes over the doorframe. No handle on the outside. The absence was almost deliberate in its neatness. There was no gap where a handle might have been removed, no hardware marks from something once attached. It had been made this way. From outside, the door could not be pulled open regardless of whether it was locked. But there was a keyhole, small iron, set into the wood at mid-height, which meant there was a lock, which meant there was a key. She noted the keyhole's shape, not the standard palace cut. Something specific. She picked up her cloth and moved back to the window ledge. The merchant carrier had a regular route through the valley road. Willa had found him in month 3, a broad man with a gray-streaked beard who delivered dry goods to the palace kitchens twice a month and returned east with whatever needed sending. She had spent 2 months making herself reliably useful to him in small ways, carrying his delivery receipts to the steward's office, alerting him when the kitchen gate was left unlatched. People who made themselves useful to reliable men acquired a kind of unexamined trust over time. In month 7, she had given him a letter for the first time. Brief, coded, names replaced with agreed-upon substitutes, locations described by landmarks rather than names. She had given him 3 copper coins and watched him tuck the letter into his vest pocket without reading it. The reply came 6 weeks later, tucked into the bottom of a flour sack, as arranged. Colin was working on the farm. He was well. He complained about the smell of the livestock and asked if she was eating properly. She read the letter 4 times and then burned it over the kitchen fire. He was alive, she wrote back. She kept 1 more year in mind and told herself it was a reasonable amount of time. Haddon began watching her in the 2nd year. She noticed it the way she had noticed the archive door, without making it visible that she had noticed. He did not do anything overt. He had too much intelligence for overt. He simply began to be present in places where she was present. Not always, not obviously, but with a frequency that crossed the boundary of coincidence. She adjusted, kept her movements predictable, gave him nothing to attach meaning to. He found her in the kitchen one afternoon in early autumn. She was dicing vegetables for the evening stock when she felt him come in. She did not look up. "You've been here over 2 years, he said. "Yes, my lord." Most serving staff request reassignment or transfer within the 1st year. They find the work hard, or the city life doesn't suit them, or they receive offers elsewhere. She kept her knife moving. "I find the work suits me." He picked up an apple from the basket near the window and turned it slowly. "Where did you say you were from originally?" "North of the Carron Valley, a small farm." "And your family?" "Gone, my lord. Fever when I was 17. "Any siblings?" "No, my lord." He took a bite of the apple and set it back in the basket. "You're quiet for someone who's been here long enough to know everyone. People get comfortable, they talk. You don't. I was raised to work more than I talk." He considered this. Then he smiled with the lower half of his face and left. She diced 3 more carrots before she trusted her hands enough to keep the knife steady. The illness came in the deep of winter, in the 2nd year's coldest month. It started as a fever. Shifters burned through most common ailments within 2 or 3 days. And at first, no one treated it as unusual. But this one did not burn through. It climbed instead, and by the 3rd day, the Alpha King's attendants were cycling through his wing at unusual frequency, their expressions controlled in the specific way of people managing alarm without displaying it. The palace healers were capable. She had observed them work. But what she was hearing described, through the fragments of conversation that passed through the kitchen, through the careful avoidance among senior staff of any direct mention of the king's condition, sounded less like a common fever and more like something particular to the shifter physiology. The way a wolf's body processed certain compounds differently, the dual nature of the blood. Her father had taught her this. The Voss had always run raiding teams through rough terrain, and a raider who died of a preventable illness in the field was a preventable loss. She knew what the fever was. She was fairly certain she knew what was making it worse. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about what it would mean to be the serving girl who had information the palace healers lacked. She thought about what Haddon would make of it. Then she thought about what would happen if the Alpha King died of something preventable while she was standing in the kitchen holding the answer. She went to Paula, the head kitchen matron, a woman of practical instincts and no particular curiosity about other people's history. "I grew up near a wolf pack," Willa said. "The fever they're describing, I've seen it before. If the healers are using the standard compound, it may be making it worse. The silver component interacts badly with the shifting tissue when a fever reaches a certain temperature. There's a root preparation. I can describe it." Paula looked at her for a long moment. "Write it down," she said. "I'll see it gets to the right hands." Willa wrote it down. She did not ask what happened next. 3 days later, the fever broke. She was in the main hall clearing the evening tables when the news moved through the staff. The king had recovered, the healers had found the right treatment, the wing was open again. Conversation resumed at the serving tables within an hour. Willa collected the remaining cups from the far end of the hall. She was almost at the corridor door when one of the king's personal attendants fell into step beside her. "The king asked about the information that came through the kitchen," he said quietly. "The root preparation." She kept walking. "I only described what I had seen before." He asked about the serving girl who provided it. I wouldn't want to take credit for something the healers managed. The attendant gave her a measured look and dropped back. She went through the door. In the corridor, alone for 30 seconds, she felt it. The thing she had been keeping carefully compressed for 2 years folded into the smallest possible shape every time it moved. The proximity had cracked something open. He was one corridor away, and she was acutely, unmanageably aware of him in a way that went past her senses into something she had no clean language for. She knew what it was. That was the worst part. She had grown up in a clan. She had watched bonded pairs her whole life. She understood the recognition, had seen what it looked like from outside, and now understood with brutal clarity what it felt like from inside. Involuntary, total, completely indifferent to timing, to circumstance, to the fact that the man, one corridor away, had ordered the death of everyone she had grown up knowing. She rerouted back through the east end of the kitchen and did not pass near the recovery wing for 3 days. The third year moved differently than the first 2. She noticed it in small increments. The way she had stopped cataloging exits every time she entered a new room. The way the palace had acquired, without her permission, the specific texture of a place she knew. Not home, she was careful about that word, but known. She was still writing to Colin. He was still writing back. He had apparently mastered spelling by his 2nd year on the farm and developed strong opinions about grain storage, which he communicated at length. She answered every letter with the same care she had given to the first. She kept them brief. She never mentioned the palace by name, never gave him anything that could locate her if the letters reached wrong hands. He was 17, she realized one morning while calculating the months. The boy she had unpeeled from her sleeve in a doorway before dawn was 17, and she had not stood in the same room with him in 3 years. She folded the thought and went to work. In the autumn of the 3rd year, the letters stopped. The first absence she marked and waited. The second, she wrote again through the merchant carrier, asking for confirmation. The third silence arrived 6 weeks after the second, and landed differently from all the silences before it. She did not have a name for what she did with it. She carried it through the days of that autumn, through the increasingly cold mornings and the early dark, through meals served and floors cleaned, and the careful maintenance of Bess, who asked nothing and wanted nothing and had no history worth examining. She began planning a route east. She told herself she had time. She told herself she would leave cleanly, after 1 more week, after she had confirmed a few more things. She told herself there were still questions she had not found answers to, and it was reasonable to stay a little longer. The letters had stopped. The East Wing archive remained locked. She had been telling herself 1 more week for 11 days when she turned right at the corridor branch instead of left and found Haddon standing 10 feet behind her with his hands clasped at his back and his particular smile already in place. She had run out of weeks. The waiting room had 2 chairs and a candle. Willa took the chair nearest the wall and sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight. The candle was tallow, not wax. The good candles were for rooms where people of consequence waited. She noted this, and noted the single door, and noted the window, which looked out onto the inner courtyard from a height of roughly 20 feet. Haddon had said nothing after the corridor. He had walked, she had followed, and he had left her here with the particular absence of instruction that was itself a kind of instruction. She was not under arrest. She was not free. She occupied a space between the two that she knew better than to test. She listened to his footsteps move away and counted the seconds until they became inaudible. Then she sat with what she had: the East Wing corridor, the archive door, the keyhole she had no key for. She had 3 versions of the story she'd been constructing for 3 years, arranged by risk. Version 1, genuinely lost, genuinely mistaken about the corridor assignment, nothing more. She could sustain this with the right level of confusion and none of the tight-wound steadiness that Haddon had already clocked in 2 years of observation. Version 2, she had heard, incorrectly, that the back storerooms in the East Wing needed inventory. This required a source. She had one, a servant who owed her a small, quiet favor and who would not be eager to be named. Version 3 was the truth, which she had no intention of offering to anyone in this palace. She sorted through the details of version 2 and decided it would hold. The candle burned. The courtyard outside was dark and empty. She thought about Colin on the road. She thought about the merchant carrier who had never asked her a single question in 3 years of exchanged letters, and whether he had spoken now under pressure or coin, and whether the letters themselves had ever mattered less than the pattern around them, the delivery days, the kitchen tallies, the farm east of the Karen crossing that received the same dry goods on the same route often enough for a patient man to notice. She had been careful. She had always been careful. But careful was a matter of degree. And what she was careful against had shifted in the last 2 months from a vague institutional threat into something with Haddon's specific face and Haddon's specific pattern of being present slightly too often in slightly too many places. She was still rehearsing version 2 when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Haddon's. She knew Haddon's footsteps, slightly longer stride on the right side, the small characteristic drag of a man who had injured his left ankle at some point in the past and had not quite corrected it since. These were different, measured even, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical size and everything to do with how a person moved through a space they had always occupied without question. She stood before the door opened. The Alpha King came in alone. No guard. No attendant. He shut the door behind him with the quiet deliberateness of someone who wanted it shut and did not need anyone else to do it. He did not take the chair on his side of the table. He stood beside it, one hand resting on the table's edge, and looked at her with the directness of a man who had made a decision before entering the room. She had spent 3 years not looking at him directly. In the moments where avoidance was impossible, she had looked at his shoulder, at the table, at the middle distance past his ear. She had built up an image in pieces: height, the dark fall of his hair, the particular set of his jaw when he was dealing with something that required patience he had already spent, the beard, grown full but trimmed close to the face. Now she looked at him and found that the image she had assembled was accurate and also completely inadequate. He was tired. Not visibly, not in any way that would be obvious to someone who hadn't spent 3 years in the same building learning the difference between his various silences. But the tiredness was there, settled into the space around his eyes and the particular stillness he used instead of showing it. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat. He remained standing. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. She waited. "You have been in this palace for 3 years," he said finally. "In that time, you have not requested a single reassignment. You have not formed close attachments to other staff. You visit no one in the city during your free half-days. You send no money home." He paused. "People who are running from something behave this way. People who are looking for something also behave this way." She kept her voice neutral. "I wasn't aware my habits were unusual, my lord. Most people working a position like yours are saving towards something. A marriage, a farm, passage to another city. You spend almost nothing." He tilted his head slightly. "What are you saving toward?" "Security, my lord. My childhood was not certain." He looked at his hand on the table and then back at her. "What is your name?" She had the answer ready. She had always had it ready. "Bess," she said. "My lord." Something in his expression didn't change so much as settle. The way a weight settles when it reaches the surface it was always going to reach. "No," he said. "The name you arrived with is not yours. I have known that since your first week." He did not say it with emphasis, did not lean into the revelation. It was a statement of established fact, offered without drama. "I am not asking about Bess." The candle between them moved in a draft from beneath the door. Willa looked at his face. She had been preparing for the version 2 story for the past hour, had it arranged and ready, had the servant's name on the edge of her tongue as a source. But there was something in the specific quality of the silence he had created. Not a trap, not a test, or if it was a test, one of a kind she didn't have a prepared answer for, that made version 2 feel not just inadequate, but wrong in a way she couldn't immediately place. He had known since the first week. 3 years of knowing, and he had said nothing. She looked at the candle. "Willa," she said. "My name is Willa." She let one breath pass. "I am from the Voss clan." The room went quiet, not the quiet of impact, of something landing hard and spreading out. A different quiet. The quiet of something that had been suspended for a very long time, finally touching down. He did not move. His expression did not rearrange itself into surprise or recognition, or any of the responses she had imagined in various dark hours this moment producing. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a specific sentence for 3 years, and now that it had arrived, was not certain what came next. She studied him. She could not help it. "You knew the name was false," she said. "You didn't ask." "No." "For 3 years." "Yes." She waited. There was something in his stillness that was not evasion. It was the stillness of a man who understood that whatever he said next would carry a particular weight and was taking the time to be sure of it. He opened his mouth. The knock at the door was hard. 3 knocks, close together, the pattern of urgency rather than protocol. He turned. "Come." The door opened to reveal a young attendant, barely 20, with the controlled breathing of someone who had moved quickly and was managing it. His eyes went to Willa for a fraction of a second before correcting back to the king. "My lord, I am sorry to interrupt." He did not sound sorry. He sounded like a man delivering information he would have preferred someone else deliver. Lord Haddon dispatched riders to the Valley Road this evening. They located a young man at a farm east of the Karen Crossing. He is being brought to the palace. The silence changed. "Under whose order did Haddon dispatch those riders?" the Alpha King said. "His own, my lord. He has not brought it before council. The riders were sent before the evening meal." She felt the table edge beneath her fingertips. She did not remember reaching for it. The attendant's eyes moved to her again, briefly, and this time she understood why. The Valley Road east of the Karen Crossing. A farm. A young man. The Alpha King's gaze came back to her. She looked at him, and she did not look away, and she felt, with a clarity that left no room for anything else, what she had spent 3 years folding into the smallest possible shape, because there was never a moment when she could afford to let it out. It came through her the way a bell comes through stone, not a sound so much as a vibration, moving from some central point outward until it reached the surface and had nowhere else to go. The name she had just said aloud for the first time in 3 years had done something to the careful compression she had maintained. Like a door, slightly opened, like a string, fractionally released. She knew what it was. She had known what it was since the winter of her 2nd year, in the corridor outside the recovery wing, when proximity and relief and exhaustion had cracked the thing open for one unguarded moment before she had slammed it back into place. She had named it to herself in the privacy of her own mind, accepted it as fact, and then built the next 18 months of her life around not thinking about it any further because there was nothing to be done with it that did not lead somewhere she couldn't afford to go. The mate bond was not a metaphor. It was not a feeling of connection or an emotional resonance or a figurative pull. It was a physical thing, occupying space in the center of her chest, and when she said her true name out loud, it had moved. Not dramatically, not overwhelmingly, but it had moved in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who knew what to feel for. She looked at Ivar's face. He was looking at her with an expression that was not readable in any single word, but was readable in some. He felt it too. He had felt it too, probably not for the first time, and he had been watching her across that specific sensation for some duration she didn't know. And he was looking at her now, the way you look at something you've been waiting to confirm exists. Neither of them said anything about it. There was a 17-year-old boy on a road 3 days east who had been picked up by Haddon's men, and there was no version of the next several hours in which any of this other thing could be addressed. She looked at the attendant. "How many riders?" The attendant blinked. He looked at the Alpha King. "Answer her," the king said. "4, my lady. They should reach the palace by mid-morning tomorrow, riding through the night." She looked at the table. She thought about Colin at 14, his sleeve in her hand, the way he had not made a sound in the cellar for hours. "He is my brother," she said. To Ivar, not the attendant, directly. "His name is Colin. He was 14 when the clan was destroyed. I placed him with a family on that farm. He is not involved in whatever Haddon has decided I represent." Ivar held her gaze. "I understand. He has no information that could matter to anyone. He doesn't know where I am. He doesn't know I came here. He was a child, and he has been on a farm for 3 years, learning to spell." "I understand," he said again. Something in the second repetition was different from the first, steadier, with a particular quality of intention behind it. She was not certain she knew what to do with intention from him. She was not certain she had any framework for it. The attendant was still standing in the doorway. "Leave us," the Alpha King said. When the attendant had gone and the door had shut, "Tomorrow morning before the council convenes, can you be in the east courtyard at first light?" She looked at him. "Yes, I will handle Haddon and the council, but I need to know—" He stopped. He looked at her steadily. "I need to know if you intend to leave." The question was specific, and she understood its specificity. Not, "Can I trust you?" Not, "Will you cooperate?" Whether she intended to take Colin and disappear the moment she had access to him, before whatever conversation they had been about to have could finish itself. She thought about the archive door with its specific keyhole and no handle. She thought about the letters he had not had written, and the conversation he had not had her expelled for starting. She thought about 3 years of questions she had not found answers to, and the particular way he had looked when she said her name. Not surprised. Not surprised at all. "I have been here 3 years looking for something," she said. "I haven't found it yet." He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the brief, clean nod of someone who has received the answer they needed. He left. She sat alone in the room with the tallow candle burning down and the courtyard dark outside the window, and the mate bond settled back into its place in her chest. Quieter now, but no less present. And she thought about what it meant that he had known her name was false since her first week and had never once asked. She thought about this for a long time. She did not sleep at all that night. The council chamber smelled of old stone and tallow. Willa stood near the back wall, not quite between the guards who flanked her, but close enough that the positioning was clear to anyone paying attention. She had been escorted here without instruction about where to stand or what to say. She had chosen the wall herself. Haddon was already speaking when she arrived. He stood at the head of the long table with his hands clasped in front of him, and the particular quality of composure that came not from calm, but from certainty. He had rehearsed this. Not the words. Men like Haddon did not rehearse words. He had rehearsed the outcome. The words were secondary. "The facts are not in dispute," he said. "A woman entered this palace 3 years ago under a false name and false history. She remained here without incident, an unusual word for a situation of this kind, while moving freely through a staff position that granted her access to the main hall, the inner corridors, and the movements of the court. She was found last night at the door of the East Archive." He paused. "She is Voss." He said it the way people said it in the years after the clan was destroyed, not as a name, as a category. Around the table, 7 counselors sat in varying states of attention. The oldest, a broad man with iron-gray hair, turned a ring slowly on his right hand. 2 younger men on the near side exchanged a brief look. No one interrupted. "The charge I bring before this council is espionage." "On what evidence?" The broad man's voice was unhurried. 3 years of deliberate concealment. That is a description of behavior. It is not evidence of a crime. Haddon's chin lifted a fraction. Concealment is evidence of intent. Concealment can also indicate fear. A Voss survivor entering palace service 3 years after a military action against her clan under a false name might have compelling reasons for secrecy that have nothing to do with intelligence gathering. The broad man looked down the table toward Ivar. "The Alpha King has reviewed the matter?" Ivar sat halfway down the table's length, not at its head. Both forearms rested on the chair's carved arms, and he had not moved since Willa entered the room. She had not looked at him directly. She had been aware of him anyway, the way she was always aware of him, a fact she had long since stopped resenting. "I have," he said. "And your position? The charge is not supported." Haddon's posture did not change. "With respect, the Alpha King's assessment has been clouded by evidence," Ivar said, "by which I mean the absence of it." A beat. The younger counselor on the near side cleared his throat. "If there is no evidence of transmitted intelligence, there is no espionage. The matter of the false name is a separate and considerably lesser issue." "She was at the archive," Haddon said. "She was in a corridor, at the archive door, which she did not enter because she had no key, and because you have offered no evidence that she crossed that threshold at all." The broad man set his ring hand flat on the table. "I will ask plainly. Do you have evidence that information left this palace through her?" Haddon's gaze moved once to Willa and back. "I have evidence sufficient to—" "Do you have it or not?" A silence. "Not as yet. Then the charge does not stand." The broad man looked at Ivar. "I assume you have something to propose?" Ivar rose. "She stays," he said, "under royal protection. No removal, no further questioning without my presence, no contact from household authority." He did not raise his voice. "Until I determine otherwise." The room received this. Willa kept her face level. She understood what the room heard. An Alpha King placing personal protection over a Voss survivor with no explanation offered. She understood what that looked like. She also understood that it was the only reason Colin would still be alive by nightfall if Haddon's riders reached him first. Haddon's voice came very carefully. "The Council should consider what this signals to other packs." "The Council should consider," Ivar said, "whether it wants to spend the morning arguing with me over a woman who has given no evidence of harm." The broad man looked between the two of them with the expression of someone watching a river rise against a dam and calculating which side to stand on. "Done," he said. "The matter is tabled pending evidence. The Alpha King's protection stands." Two counselors looked annoyed. One looked relieved. Haddon did not look like any of those things. He looked the way a man looks when a plan is interrupted at a specific point, not broken, just rerouted. He gathered his papers and said nothing further. Willa was escorted out. In the corridor, a palace attendant was waiting. "The riders from the Valley Road have returned, my lady. The young man is in the east receiving court." She heard him before she saw him. Not voice, footsteps. A pace she recognized from years ago, slightly uneven on the right because he had rolled an ankle badly at 13 and refused to stay off it long enough. She had argued with him about it in the kitchen while their mother watched from the doorway. Their mother had been dead for 3 years. Willa stopped in the archway. Colin stood in the east, receiving court with both hands shoved into the pockets of a coat too light for the season. He had grown. She had known he would have, had calculated it, and still found the reality unprepared. His hair was the same rusted auburn as their father's, cut short but not carefully. The eyes were their mother's, pale blue and very alert. He was looking at the palace walls when he heard her step and turned. She watched him place her. It took a moment. She had cut her hair and she was thinner in the face, and she had spent 3 years learning to hold herself differently, and she saw all of it register in the space of a breath. Then something in him settled, and he looked at her the way she had been afraid he would. Without warmth, without anger, with a careful blankness that was worse than either. "You cut your hair," he said. "Yes." He looked at the palace wall above her head. "They told me nothing. Just that I needed to come. I know. I don't know what I'm doing here. I understand that as well." He looked at her then. Really looked. She let him. 3 years had changed him in the ways that 3 years always changed a person, moving from 14 to 17. He was broader in the shoulder. His face had lengthened, losing the roundness she remembered. But under all of it was the boy she had unpeeled from her sleeve in a doorway before dawn, and the sight of him made the years stack up in a way she did not have room to process right now. "Why here?" he said. "Why this place? It's complicated. 3 years and it's still complicated." She did not argue with that. "There are things I can tell you, she said. "And things I cannot tell you yet. Not because I don't want to. Because the telling needs to happen in a certain order, and this courtyard is not the right place." He studied her face. "Are you safe here?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" She thought about Haddon. "There is someone here who would prefer I wasn't." That situation was addressed this morning. Addressed meaning resolved? Addressed meaning contained. She held his gaze. "I need you to stay in the rooms they assign you. Don't go anywhere with men you don't recognize. If a guard tells you something, ask him to write it down." His brows drew together. "That's a specific instruction." "Yes? What does it cover?" "Anyone trying to move you before I tell you to." He absorbed this. He did not look afraid, which was either composure or inexperience, and she suspected it was some of both. He had been 14 at the worst moment she could imagine. He had survived the farm and 3 years of not knowing where she was, and 2 men appearing before dawn to bring him to a palace with no explanation. Whatever he was now, passivity had not been part of how he built it. "Fine," he said, "but I want to know the complicated things." "You will. Not eventually. Soon." "Soon," she said. "I promise." He looked at her for another second. Then he turned back toward the palace interior with his hands still in his pockets and his shoulders carrying more tension than a 17-year-old should have needed to learn. She watched him go and did not call him back. She did not sleep the first night. The second passed in pieces and left before full dark. By the third night, her body made the decision her mind kept refusing. She left through the servant's side gate well past the last bell. No destination, just the tree line. The first shift in 3 years was not gentle. Her knees hit the dirt before her bones had finished, and she stayed down, chest heaving, the specific violence of a body reclaiming its full shape after years of compression too thorough to call anything other than what it was. It hurt in layers. Muscle, marrow, something deeper than those. She had always heard shifters describe long absences from wolf form as ache. This was less articulate than ache and more honest than anything she would have chosen. She came out of it on all fours with her weight balanced low and the forest fully open around her. The anger was the first thing. She had known it was there, had been aware of it all 3 years as a low, persistent pressure she managed by keeping busy, by keeping small, by moving through the palace with her eyes on floors and her thoughts on the next task. Out here, it had no manager. It moved through her clean and total, not rage, but something older and less selective, the distilled product of everything her wolf had been holding through corridors and candlelit rooms and years of watching, and never once simply running. She ran. Through the first tree line and up the long slope beyond it, underbrush breaking soft under her paws, the cold air full of information she had been starved of for 3 years. The forest was dense and dark and enormous, and she covered ground like it was owed to her. She crested the ridge and pulled up short. Another wolf in the trees ahead. Dark coat, large, standing with the stillness of something that had been there a while already. Ivar. Her wolf knew him before her mind reached the recognition. Not rank, not authority, not the political fact of who he was. Something prior to all of that. Something that went backward from the present to the night she had first walked into the palace and registered his presence at 50 yards distance without understanding why she could. The mate bond in wolf form was not a metaphor for something else. It was its own thing. A current in the blood. A pull that did not insist but did not absent itself either. That made the 20 yards between them feel specific in a way physical distance usually did not. He did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. He stood with his ears slightly forward and his head level, making no claim, issuing no challenge. After a moment, he shifted sideways, a deliberate movement, making space near the ridgeline without crossing toward her. An opening, not a pressure. She moved to the higher ground and stood there. Below them, the forest settled into its ordinary late-hour work. The shift of a bird branch to branch somewhere east. The distant sound of water over stone. The small, quick lives in the undergrowth going about their business, without any awareness of the two wolves on the ridge doing nothing at all. Ivar lowered himself to the ground near the roots of a large pine. Not submissive, not watchful in the way of something waiting to act. Simply present, in the specific way of a body that had been many places, and was, for this moment, here. Willa stayed on her feet another minute. Then she settled onto her haunches in the damp leaves. The bond ran between them at whatever distance they had chosen. She felt the shape of his awareness, not thought, not emotion in any human sense, but the particular quality of another wolf's attention turned fully in one direction without apology or concealment. She let herself feel it without building a wall around it. She had been building walls for 3 years. It was enough to feel it and not name it, not decide anything, just know. Full dark came properly around them. She was not certain how much time passed. Enough that her breathing steadied and the anger finished its first run-through and settled into something quieter beneath the surface where it had always lived. He rose first. He did not signal anything. He moved back through the trees on the far side of the ridge and disappeared between the trunks with the particular silence of a wolf in familiar ground. She watched the space where he had been. She stayed another few minutes alone on the ridge. Then she turned back toward the palace walls. She went past the archive door the following afternoon by the same route she always used from the East Corridor stairs. She had legitimate reason for the corridor. The senior housekeeper had moved 3 rooms to the East Wing for the influx of staff managing Colin's supervision, and the linen stores were 2 doors down from the archive. She was not there for the archive. She had not made any decision to stop. Her eyes went to the door the same way they always had. Old habit, older impulse. 3 years of cataloging what she passed. The keyhole at mid-height, the iron banding, the hinges oiled by someone who had been here recently. She moved closer than she usually let herself. The torchlight was low at this end. She was looking at the door because it was in front of her, and she was always careful about what was in front of her, and that was why she saw it. The frame, not the door. The inner edge of the frame where wood met stone on the right side, low enough that a person standing would not see it without crouching. A carving, not ornamental, not old damage. Letters, cut deliberately, with a steadiness that spoke of patience. She crouched. Gareth Voss, her father's name, spelled correctly, no flourish, just the name in clean straight lines pressed into old wood. The cuts were not fresh, they had darkened with age, the same deep color as the surrounding grain. But they were not ancient either. Some years had passed. Not many. She stayed crouched for a long time looking at the letters. She knew the name was right. The spelling, the particular middle-length form he had always used on correspondence, rather than the shortened version his brothers called him, the same one he had taught her to write when she was 5. It was exact. She stood. She looked at the closed door, at the keyhole, at the corridor empty in both directions. She thought about the name engraved there, at a height only someone searching for it would find. On a door, the Alpha King was the only person to lock and unlock. She did not sleep that night either. She heard the commotion from the inner yard. Colin had asked to walk the stable lane. He had been confined to rooms for 2 days and was beginning to move with the tightly controlled restlessness of someone measuring walls, so she had petitioned the guard assigned to him to extend the permitted area to the inner yard and the lane adjacent. The guard, a solid older man from the non-Haddon household staff, had agreed. She heard the horse scream and was moving before the second sound. The stable lane was narrow between its stone walls. When she reached it, the scene was already in motion. One horse loose between the stalls, white-eyed and driving forward, and Colin in the churned dirt below its path, with one arm raised, and the solid older guard on the ground near the far wall with blood at his temple. The angle of the loose horse was not accidental. Frightened animals scatter. They do not aim. Willa was too far. She knew it in the first step. 15 yards with the horse already driving, and Colin not yet on his feet, and nothing she could cross the space with in time. Ivar came from the opposite entrance. She registered the movement, and then it was already over. He had the horse by the bridle strap, his weight thrown hard enough to wrench the animal's momentum sideways before its hooves came down where Colin had been. The horse screamed and fought the hold, and he did not release it. His boots carved furrows in the mud as the animal pulled, and still he did not release it. Stable hands arrived in numbers a moment later. Someone caught the trailing rein. Another pair of hands took the second stall gate. Colin rolled clear on one knee, mud down his coat, one palm flat against the ground. Willa crossed to him. He was winded and shaken, and there was a scrape along the back of his hand that would bruise by morning. She checked his face, his eyes, the way he was holding himself. He nodded before she asked the question. She looked up. By the time she did, Haddon was at the far end of the lane. Not in the lane. Beyond it, at the entrance that opened onto the inner courtyard, as though the commotion had drawn him there a moment late. He made no move to leave. Ivar handed the horse to the senior groom. Then he turned. The stable hands moved back without being told. The lower latch on the far stall was opened from the outside. Ivar said. Haddon's expression did not shift. The animals are agitated. The handlers, the lower latch, from outside. Haddon looked at him steadily. A regrettable, "You are done." Ivar's voice did not rise. It did not need to. Your authority over the inner guard ends today. Your household staff does not enter the stable wing, the east corridor, or any guest accommodation. If I find evidence of another action against anyone under my protection, you will leave this palace before that night ends. A silence spread through the lane. The horses had calmed. The grooms were very busy looking at other things. Haddon let the silence run for a moment that was perhaps one beat too long to be pure composure. You are making an error, he said. Then it will be mine to make. Haddon's eyes moved once to Willa, once to Colin, still on his knee in the mud, then back. He turned and walked out through the courtyard entrance without any hurry. The lane noise returned in pieces, a horse blowing air through its nose, the scrape of a bucket, someone speaking quietly to the gelding in the far stall. Colin got fully to his feet and looked at his coat. I like this coat, he said. He sounded angry rather than shaken, which was, Willa thought, exactly the correct response. She said nothing. There was nothing adequate, and she had long since learned that adequate was not always the goal. Across the lane, Ivar was speaking quietly to the senior groom, not looking in her direction. He did not need to. She was aware of him with the same certainty she had been aware of him for 3 years, and for the first time she did not fold it away. She let it stand. Then she put her hand briefly on Colin's shoulder and walked him back toward the palace. The key was small. Ivar left it on the table in the east corridor the morning after the stable yard. No note, no instruction. Just the key placed where she would find it on her way to the linen stores. A small iron thing with a specific cut she had memorized from the keyhole 2 years ago. She picked it up and stood with it for a moment. Then she walked to the archive door. The lock opened without resistance. The door swung inward on the oiled hinges, and the room beyond was dark until she carried the corridor torch in from its bracket and set it on the table inside. The flame steadied. The room came forward. It was smaller than she had imagined. A single table, 4 shelves of bound documents, a narrow window set too high in the wall to see through from standing height, a stool, a candle holder with old wax pooled around its base. The kind of room that existed to be used, not to be impressive. She set the torch in the holder and looked at the shelves. The documents were organized without obvious system. Not by date, not by subject, not alphabetically. She pulled the first bound set and opened it. Maps, territory records, northern border surveys going back a generation. She set them aside. The second set was administrative, tax assessments for the Western territories. She set those aside too. The third was thinner than the others. No binding title on the cover. She opened it. The first page was a letter written in a hand she did not recognize. Formal, official, the language of people who had spent their lives communicating at a distance about things that cost other people. It was addressed to the Alpha King, dated approximately 3.5 years ago, 4 months before the massacre. She read it once, then again. It described a weapon. Not a weapon the way iron is a weapon. Something developed over years inside the Voss clan's most interior structure. A sickness engineered through pack magic and passed through proximity among shifted wolves. Targeted by bloodline, specific in its path, capable of moving through a region's shifter population within a season if released. The intelligence had been gathered over 18 months. The sources were named and cross-referenced. The conclusion was written in the flat language of people who had already made a decision and were documenting it rather than deliberating. 12 signatures at the bottom. She had to stop reading and look at the wall. She breathed. Then she turned the page. The second document was Ivar's response to the council. It was the shortest thing in the archive. 1 page, his hand, his signature. He acknowledged the intelligence. He stated that action would be taken within 60 days. He accepted sole command. That was all. She turned the next page. A list of names. Every member of the Voss clan. She recognized most of them. Her father was halfway down the first column. Her mother below him. Cousins she had grown up running with. The woman who had taught her to read. 2 boys she had learned to shift alongside. Her own name was not on the list. She looked at the place where it would have been. The list was alphabetical by first name within family groupings. The space was simply not there. She turned another page. The letters were bound separately. Individual sheets, unsealed, each folded once and marked on the outside with a single name. She went through the outer folds without opening them. There were 23 letters, 1 for each adult member of the clan. She found her father's name on the 5th one she checked. She sat down on the stool and held it for a moment without opening it. The torchlight moved slightly. The room smelled of old parchment and stone. She opened it. It began without formal address. No title, no honorific. Just the name at the top, written the same way it had been cut into the doorframe. She read the whole letter. When she finished, she folded it closed again and set it on the table in front of her and sat very still for a long time. The letter did not explain. It did not justify. It laid out what Ivar had known, what the council had presented, what he had believed about the timeline and the risk and the number of lives that the intelligence suggested were at stake if the weapon was released. It did not spare itself. He had had other options. He named them specifically prisoner extraction, advance warning, targeted removal of the clan's interior leadership. He had rejected them on the grounds of speed and certainty. He had believed, at 28 years old with the council's signatures behind him and a weapon with a season's reach in front of him, that fast was a form of mercy compared to the alternative. The letter said he no longer knew if he had been right. It said he had stopped trying to decide if he had been right because the deciding was not the point. The point was that 23 people were dead, and the only honest thing left to do with that was remember their names and not hide them in a file. The last line said, "I do not ask you to understand this. I only ask that you are not erased." She looked at the ceiling. The torchlight moved. Outside the narrow high window, a bird crossed whatever sky was up there. She heard its wings. She sat in the archive for a long time. Long enough that the torch burned down an inch and the cold in the stone room worked its way through her sleeves. She did not read the other letters. They were not hers. Then she rose and left the key on the table and pulled the door shut behind her. The garden was not formal. It sat between the east wing and the outer wall and had clearly been cared for by someone at some point in the past who had then stopped. The hedges were overgrown on the left side. The gravel path had moss in the joints. There was a stone bench near the far wall with lichen along the top that no one had troubled. Ivar was standing near the center of it when she arrived. He was not watching the door. He was looking at the far wall, one hand at his side, the other at his jaw. He turned when he heard her step on the gravel, but he did not move toward her. She crossed the garden until she was 10 feet from him and stopped. "Tell me about the options you didn't take," she said. She said it quietly, not evenly. There was nothing even about it. but without the particular crack of someone who had been holding something above their head and had finally dropped it. This was different. The weight was still there. She was simply done carrying it alone. He looked at her. He had known this was coming. She could see it in the stillness he held himself at. "Prisoner extraction," he said. "The council had intelligence on the inner leadership. 6 people. I could have gone in with a targeted team and removed them before the weapon reached its deployment stage." "Why didn't you?" "Because the intelligence on the timeline was wrong. I did not know that at the time. I believed we had less than 4 days. A targeted extraction at that speed in a clan compound with defensive shifters on rotation had a failure margin I judged too wide. And advance warning. If the weapon was already in motion and I warned the clan, the inner leadership would have activated it immediately. That was the council's assessment. That was also my assessment." He paused. "I have spent 3 years revisiting both of those assessments. And the council's intelligence was flawed in the timeline. If I had known we had 4 weeks instead of 4 days, extraction was viable." He did not look away. "I did not know. I made the calculation I had." She looked at him for a long time. "You were 28, she said. "Yes, that is not an excuse. No, it's a fact. I am not offering it as anything else." She turned and looked at the far wall. The lichen on the bench from here was a pale greenish gray, spreading slowly across the stone with the particular patience of things that did not need permission. "The letters," she said. He waited. Why? He considered the question the way he considered most things. Not performing the consideration, just doing it. Because the archive should not only contain the council's intelligence reports and my operational notes, he said. Because paper is easy to file and easy to lose. Because I did not want the only written record of those people to be a list of names in an action document. She turned back. And the name on the doorframe. Something moved in his face. "Every decision that I carry," he said, "I mark on the inside of that door. Not the outside. Not for anyone who walks past. For myself, when I enter. So that the room I work in is not a room where I have forgotten." She looked at him. "My father's name is the most recent," he said. "It has been there for 2 years. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the outer wall, a cart moved along the road and faded. Willa pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Not to stop sound. Just to feel the pressure of something solid. Then she lowered it. "I want to be clear," she said. "I am not forgiving you today. I know. I don't know if I will. I don't know if that is the shape this takes. I know. I spent 3 years building a version of you that was simpler than this." She looked at the gravel under her feet. "That version was easier to carry. I don't have it anymore." He said nothing. She had not wanted him to say anything. "I am going to stay," she said. "Not because the bond asks me to. Not because you intervened with the council or with Haddon or in the stable yard. I am staying because I came here for the truth, and I found it, and leaving now would be the same as every year I told myself 1 more week." She looked up. "I will not treat this as resolved. I will not behave as though 3 years of questions have been answered by 1 morning in an archive. But I am not leaving." "All right," he said. Just that. No relief visible, no gratitude performed. The word landed the way she had said it would. Accepted, without condition. She looked at him for another moment. "The bond," she said. He waited. "My wolf does not reject it. I don't either." She held his gaze. "But that is not the same as trust. I know the difference, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am not asking you to pretend. I know." She looked at the bench with its lichen. "I need you to know that I know." He nodded once. The particular nod of someone who has heard what was actually said and is not replacing it with what would be easier. She left the garden. Colin was awake when she knocked. He opened the door with the alertness of someone who had been sitting with something for hours rather than sleeping through it. He stood back to let her in without speaking. She sat in the chair by the window. He sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees. She told him. Not everything. Not the letter. That was Ivar's and her own. and not a story to be handed over in full the first time, but the structure of it, the weapon the clan had built, the council, the decision, the options that had existed and the reasons given for not using them. She told him about the letters in the archive, about the name on the doorframe. He listened without interrupting. His face moved through things she could not follow completely, expressions that appeared and were replaced before she had finished reading them. He was 17, and she had left him at 14. And the person who had learned to process difficult information in the years between was not someone she fully knew yet. When she finished, he sat for a long time. They built something that could kill people they'd never met, he said. The inner leadership did. I don't know how much the rest knew. Did our father know? The question landed carefully. Not without weight, just with the particular care of someone who had prepared for it. I don't know, she said. I do not have any way of knowing that. He looked at his hands. I want to be angry at someone specific, he said. I know. It would be easier. I know that too. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the palace grounds had moved into the deeper dark of late evening. A torch guttered somewhere below and caught again. I'm not leaving, she said. I want you to know that. He looked up. I'm not leaving either, he said. I don't have anywhere better to be. That was not reconciliation. She did not take it as reconciliation, but it was honest. And honest was where things that lasted actually started. She stayed with him until he fell asleep in the chair, and she draped the blanket from the bed across his shoulders and left quietly. The hall was empty at this hour. Every torch in its bracket, the long room cleared of benches for the morning cleaning, the stone floor damp where someone had already been through with the mop and bucket. The 36 tables stood in their rows. She knew their number without counting. She had last counted them on her first week to keep her hands steady. She walked the length of the room to the head table, Ivar's table, the one she had served every evening for 3 years, with her eyes on the floor and her back to the wall, and the particular discipline of a body making itself smaller than it was. She sat down. Not at the far end, not at the serving position, not at any placement that belonged to a secondary role. At the table itself, at the chair third from the head, the chair where the broad counselor had sat that morning and turned his ring. The wood was smooth under her palms. She sat for a moment in the empty room, in the torchlight, with the silence of the hall around her and 3 years folded behind her and the weight of the morning still in her chest. Not pressing down, just present. The way anything real is present, without asking permission and without requiring action. Then she lifted her eyes. The hall was just a hall. Stone ceiling, iron brackets, 36 tables she could navigate blind. She had always known what it looked like. She had looked at it in pieces, in fragments, from the corner of her gaze. From here it was different. Not larger, not more impressive, just fully seen. She stayed until the night watch made its first pass through the corridor outside, until the torch at the far end burned low enough to shift the light, until the cold in the stone finally reached the soles of her feet. Then she rose, pushed the chair back to where she found it, and walked out. The corridor outside was empty. Her footsteps on the stone were the same footsteps she had taken every evening for 3 years. Same hall, same hour, same direction. But the body that carried them was not folded anymore, and that made the corridor feel different in length. Not shorter, just traversable in a different way. She passed the east wing branch and did not look toward the archive door. She already knew what was inside. At the servant's stairwell, she paused with her hand on the wall. There was no name for what the next days would look like. She had spent 3 years inside a plan, narrow, purposeful. Every action pointed at a single question. Now the question had been answered, and the plan had no next page. She was not afraid of that. She was, perhaps for the first time in 3 years, simply uncertain in the ordinary way that people are uncertain when one chapter ends and the next has not yet declared itself. That felt unexpectedly like something close to solid ground. She climbed the stair. In the room above, the small window over her bed held the last dark before dawn. That particular shade of black that is already thinking about becoming blue. She lay down without undressing and looked at it. Colin was in a room 3 corridors over, asleep in a chair under a borrowed blanket. Ivar was somewhere in this palace, carrying the weight he had always carried, and now she knew its shape. Haddon was contained for now, which was not the same as gone. The bond sat in its place in her chest with the steadiness of something no longer being argued with. She thought about her father's name on the inside of a door no one else was meant to find. She thought about 23 letters folded on a shelf in a locked room, waiting for no one. She thought about a boy who had said, "I don't have anywhere better to be," and meant it as honestly as anything she had heard in 3 years. She did not sleep right away. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not counting anything. The window went from black to blue. She closed her eyes. The end.